Okay, today, okay. Today my partner who is I'm sorry for his absence, and I will be talking about multi-touch. And in 2007, when the first generation of iPhone was first born and bringing along the technology of multi-touch to the public notice, and it actually raised quite a lot of attention. But with its convenient and intuitive and dazzling control, and together with all these magnificent features of the iPhone, it actually soon wins the world's compliments and bring a revolution to the whole industry. However, this technology actually does not come out from nowhere, just like iPhone. The first idea of pinch to zoom, used to do things like that, was first brought up in like 1980s. It was like even earlier than the first release of Macintosh computer. So during these years of development, researchers, we actually try to find out a lot of ways to implement these things, including these few approaches are the most seen ones that are taking up the most markets currently. For example, resistive screen it dominates the last generation of phone, where you actually have to use your nails or like something sharp to poke on the screen to wait for its response. But among all these approaches, the projective capacitive screen is regarded as one of the most prospective one, and is adopted by iPhone. And today we're mainly going to discuss more about looking into this projective capacitive screen, and especially how the technical implementation of it, and especially how it sensor touch and detect the location you're touching. So let's first have a brief overview of the process. So obviously here, as you can imagine, there must be some kind of touch sensor under the screen, the cover glass of your phone, in order to detect if you are touching or not. And in this case, they are going to be a set of capacitors forming a grid. And as you may know, human body itself is a huge conductor, and when you put your hands on there, it will somehow interact with this built-in capacitor and change its capacitance, so we may be able to detect whether you're touching or not. And then the sensor or processor will then use some algorithm to determine which exact location you are touching at, to find out its specific position. But what capacitance are we actually talking about? There are actually two capacitance that we can measure, which is self-capacitance and mutual capacitance. Well, in the first figure, as you can see, there are many circles we've drawn, and they are electrodes. And these electrodes line up as a line, and that single line will be acting like a series of capacitors. And what we will be measuring is the total capacitance in a single line. And mutual capacitance is in a more advanced way, where we will be measuring the change in coupling capacitance between two electrodes in two different layers at each of their intersection, and we will be elaborating in more later. So now let me introduce you to the system respectively. Well, as I've mentioned before, rows and columns are formed of sets of electrodes and self-capacitance, as shown in the figure there. And each line actually forms a series of capacitors, and we send signals from one end and receive them in the other to determine to measure its capacitance to the ground. And actually, when your finger touches the screen, it will be acting like an additional capacitor in parallel to the original line, and thus increase the total capacitance of the line, and we can detect it. But how are we going to decide which location exactly are you touching at? So this is a bird's-eye view of the grid, and these two blue dots are the touch point you are touching. So we first send a pulse from one end of the line. It's these, we call it the in signals, and it pass through the line, and when it crosses over a touch point, the capacitance will be changed. And at the other end, we could detect these changes. And as shown in the figure, there are two rows and two columns that are marked as red, which means they detect some kind of changing capacitance. So we then can obtain a group of a couple of x and y coordinates, and can thus know that which is the position you're going to. But however, this method has one major problem, is that as two fingers in the same line will actually generate the same result, as can be seen in the figure, and this will cause some potential ambiguity. And this is called the ghost point when multi-touch happens. So these red blocks are the ghost points, and they're actually another diagonal of the rectangle generated from the blue blocks, which your finger actually is. But as I've mentioned 5 months ago, the first generation of iPhone has actually taken advantage of this way, self-capacitance. But the first generation of iPhone actually supports multi-touch gestures. So how does it actually does this? Because the key point here is that sometimes we don't hear which point you are actually pointing at, because these ghost points are actually mirrored from the original points. And so when you move your finger around, those ghost points will share the same moving trend. And the trend is what we actually care about. So these gestures, including pinch or two-finger movement, can also be recognized by the screen. And this problem could actually be solved using the more advanced way called neutral capacitors. And here, in this way, these two x-plane and y-planes are forming two different layers, and they are separated. And what we are measuring is at each intersection, the two electrodes one from the x layer and another from the y layer, they will form a capacitor in a vertical way. And that's what capacitor we are going to measure. Or we can also use an alternative way called one-layer interlocking diamond design, which each nodes will bridge through each other. But the advantage is that it will only form one layer. And pairs of adjacent nodes here, like this and this, they will all form a pair of capacitor. And when your finger actually touches the screen, it will reduce the coupling effect by interfering with the existing electrical fields between these two electrodes and attract away some charges, so that the coupling capacitance measure will actually decrease, and we can detect the touch. But the positioning process is much more complicated than a self-capacitance case. I'll try my best to explain this, because first, signal will send unlike the self-capacitance case, signals were sent here and here. In this case, signals were only sent from one plane, which is called a Y maybe. And when the driving pulse is sent at a single line at a time and sent horizontally in this case, and when it reaches a certain node, it will actually the electrodes will interact with the lower layer, maybe X-plane, and the X-plane nodes will pass the signal down here to the receiving plane, and thus the signal will be received. So we first generate send a driving signal from Y1, that's a single signal at a time, and detect all these signals at X at the same time. Then we send another signals at Y2 and Y3, and as shown by the blue arrow here, we do this in sequential. And so each Y is corresponded to a particular time. So when a change of capacitance determined at a particular X at a particular time, we will get a group of X and T, and which in this case T will be corresponding to a Y, so we can determine its location. But this is kind of this like the TDMA we've discussed in class, and this actually takes advantage of time division, that each time segment is corresponding to a Y. This is a more statistical figure about these two implementations. And note that here we actually first obtain X and T, and then use this T to determine the Y sequence. And the major difference here is that we only scan through Y plane, and in self-capacitance we scan through X plane and Y plane sequentially, but in a very short time, so it may be considered as simultaneous. And as a summary, these are some comparisons between these two methods, and most of which we have already covered. But it is still worth mentioning that in the first case, signal received will be much more stronger than the latter case, because we are actually measuring directly the change of capacity. While in the latter case, we are measuring the change generated by coupling effect, which will be kind of second-handed information. So the signal will be much more weakened. So there's an obvious trade-off between these two approaches, which in the first case, the signal is stronger and the implementation is much more easier, while in the latter case, the performance will be much better. So there are some possible improvements that is emerging if not already existing. So some people are trying to combine self-capacitance with neutral capacitance to obtain both strong signals and accuracy. And we can also obtain more information by comparing the different results gained by these two methods. And one major problem to be solved is that cell phone multi-touch screen will no longer be affected by moisture or water. Because for now, when our hands are wet or the environment is too moisturized, and there will be some drifting effect that the location detected will be maybe pixels away from your hand. And if we could further switch between self and mutual capacitor, we could even support some further functions like hover function. This is a touchless detection when hand is actually hovering above the screen. And this is basically adding a z-axis to the coordinating system. And imagine that maybe you want to move the cursor around when you're editing some text. It will be much more convenient if you can just hold your hand above the screen without blocking your size, which point you're pointing at. And some further thoughts may involve if we could implement these functions as to detect the pressure of touching, or maybe which angle or which direction your hand is coming from, and so on. We think that if these further functions can be implemented, it will really be a pleasure or to operate on such multi-touch screen in the future.
Very nice.